Back once again. It's been a while since I videoed anything. It's been a while since I played anything, or at least played anything solo. Played some coin opposed and Fire in the Lake and bits and bobs, but a couple of games of that and other things. But solo has taken something of a back seat. I was trying to learn OCS and I was playing Reluctant Enemies, which is great. I got 6 turns into it and my cats destroyed the game, started eating the counters. So I gritted my teeth and reset it up and started playing again, and my cats destroyed it again about 2 turns in this time, and at that point I had something of a sense of humour failure. That was back in November, and I've taken something of a rest, you know. There was Christmas and stuff, seeing friends, gaming more sociably, and pondering what to do about the combination of large, complex war games and cats like that little beast that's running amok there. See what I'm talking about? This is what I'm talking about. So the answer to this, for the moment at least, until I can get some sort of cat exclusion zone set up somehow, which I don't think is in this apartment, so yeah, that's right, is to play shorter things, like I've done with what is it, the Musket and Pike series, you know, Battles from Saints in Armour, and I've got Nothing Gained But Glory waiting. Now, I did manage to get through Unconditional Surrender, which was on the table for about a month, but you know, the counter density is pretty low. Anyway, what we've got going on here, Reluctant Enemies is a very late release in the OCS series. I'm going back to one of the very, very early titles here that I bought used and punched, which is Enemy at the Gates, which is sort of Stalingrad. It's a big 4-mapper, but I'm playing one of essentially the sort of super small training scenarios just to get back into things, which is the Battle of the Chir River battles on the south side of well, not necessarily south, anyway, on the banks of the Don, and this is just a 3-turn battle in which the Russians are attacking a very weak German line, but they've got very little time to get to an objective hex, and there's essentially a big strong Panzer division sitting nearby ready to pounce on them and, you know, thwart their attempts to get to the objectives. So that's the basic setup, and I'm just the basic idea, I'm just setting it up here. You can see a lot of absolute, in German OCS terms, a lot of absolute crud along here. Alert battalions and breakdown regiments and all kinds of things that are very, very weak, bolstered at points in the line by slightly better quality troops. You can see that light blue Luftwaffe unit in there and another one up there, and a badly beaten up infantry division sat there. So the sort of main bridges across this Chir river river line that they're defending are actually held by their, you know, their stronger units. I wouldn't say good units, but stronger units. But there is a Panzer division sat there, the far stack of which you can see the artillery partially hidden there. That artillery and the 3 units under that artillery are all full strength armour, and that's the main sort of punching force. But there's and the to the left of the to the HQ is another stack of decent stuff. You know, they've got a mechanised, I think an anti-tank unit in there, and a motorcycle sort of recon unit. But they're all high AR, good combat strength, you know, tasty units, and then a lot of supply and trucks and crap under that HQ. And that's basically the German setup that I've done. So I'm going to get the Russians down here. This is only 3 turns long, so I'm just going to try and rattle through it this morning, and have some fun with it. Maybe play it again, reset it up, try and do things a little bit differently, just mess around with it basically. And then I've got another one, a larger one of these, same map, which is about where the Germans are on the attack, and they're trying to punch a hole through a Russian line and get some supply back up into an encircled force in the pocket around Stalingrad. So that's my next plan with Enemy at the Gates, but that won't be today. I'm just going to mess around with this today, and I'll natter about it as I go along, I guess. So you can see now the Russians in place. If I zoom in a bit, again they're matching the Germans along the other side of the river line largely, but you can see, if you can read the numbers on there, with in some places substantially better units. Their big heavy hitting force is that large stack there, I think is the 5th Mechanised Corps, if I remember it rightly, and all their supply is coming via that HQ behind in the background. I'm using 4.1 rules. I think Enemy at the Gates had version 1.0, but I'm using 4.1, and I think the suggestion there is to cut down the supply by 25%. So for example, this scenario has 10 supply under that HQ, and I've cut that down to 7 supply and 2T, so 75% of the normal supply, and I've done that across the board. And I don't really know what I'm doing because I haven't studied the version 1 rules at all to see how anything changes. I really don't care enough. I'm going to use the version 4 and see how we go. I want the Russians to have enough supply to be able to attack, but not so much that they can just attack and move across the entire line with impunity. So the supply has to be providing some restriction, but not so much that they have to get everything perfect. And this is the kind of goings on that I just don't need. So I'm going to go and deal with one of my cats getting interested in my game and try and start playing. Alright, so I've chased the cats away, and I thought we'll just take a slightly closer look at what we've got going on here. This game's only 3 turns long, and a lot of this, and it's very small, as you can see, by OCS standards, or by a lot of wargame standards, so it's a tiny little scenario here, all in the picture there. A lot of this will be very obvious to OCS players, veterans, but when you're new to the system like me, things like little situations like this that might crop up and form sort of one part of a much larger game when you're playing the campaigns and the larger games, but situations like this really sort of focus your sort of understanding of the rules and understanding of how to play, and I just find fascinating in their own right a lot of the time. Little puzzly sort of intriguing situations that are short and thought-provoking. So in this particular game you can see the Russians set up along this line here, round there. Their major sort of attacking threat, the 5th motorised in the centre of the picture there, and then another potent stack there, the 1st tank there, and what's underneath it, and potent in the sense that what's around it is largely complete crap, as you can see, utter crud, and then, you know, some solid units holding the line along the line, and this Russian force has got 3 turns to get to this hex here, which just has that railroad unit in it and some supply underneath it. And so the question is how to accomplish that in 3 turns. So essentially you're trying to get through the German line somewhere and then drive down here and take that without this panzer units here intercepting you. So the obvious way to do that is just to punch a hole straight through where that Luftwaffe, that light blue Luftwaffe division is, 8th Field there. Punch a hole there and just roll tracked units that aren't using truck movement straight down the road. But then you have to wonder how you're going to keep them in supply when these panzers roll across and try and cut you off, because they'll slide back in behind you and cut you out of supply. So you've got to then think about how you're going to open up enough of a gap to supply reasonably safely. Then there's this force here. I mean, so then you might look at this force here and you think, well, maybe that can punch its way through and just, you know, maybe we can screen. Maybe we can punch our way through these crappy alerts and break down units here and get into this area and try and screen there. So those kind of things are interesting. Just in a terms of a turn sequence way of handling the game, you know, this kind of scenario is practice for whether you, for example, you use the 54th Guard there and the artillery up there to try and disrupt this, the artillery up there to try and disrupt this, and the 54th Guard there to attack it, and then have these guys in reserve to try and exploit later on in the turn sequence. Or do you ram these guys straight down the throats of the Germans immediately and look for a big enough result on the combat table that you get exploit movement anyway? Who knows? Who knows? Those kind of things I really don't understand at all. And I don't understand the sort of odds on the tables and how those kind of decisions fit together. One way or another, though, I'm going to try and get that 5th Motorised Corps through the German line here and out down this road, in some way supplied. And I'm going to do what I thought I was going to do and try and use the 1st Tank Brigade there and whatever's underneath it. I think there's another armour unit and some more good stuff to hack around, perhaps overrunning in this area, this crappy alert breakdown nonsense that's surrounding them, and then, as I say, try and screen off to minimise the chances of these this Panzer division intercepting our main thrust of our attack. And I think that's the outline plan. It seems a decent plan. I'm sure that the actual tactical doing of it I can screw up in a dozen different ways, but you know, that's why I'm playing these games, to learn that stuff. So onward. So maybe I'm doing something wrong here, but this looks to me like one of the weaknesses of this, or a primary weakness of this scenario as a competitive exercise. The Germans won initiative. The Germans are the black dice there, the red Russians. So they were 8-3. There's nothing in the setup rules that suggests that in this scenario the Russians go first. This scenario starts on turn 5, and the rules simply say that on turns 1, 2 and 3 of a game, the Russians get the choice of initiative. Oh, the Russians get the choice of whether to go first. They get the initiative, but after that, this game runs from turns 5 to 7. It's a random roll as normal. So the Germans win, and that just means that they can shift this Panzer division straight round here, block that bridge up with tanks, stick some artillery in behind it, albeit in move mode, and garrison the objective hex with that Luftwaffe unit again in move mode, with some stuff in front of it. Lots of supply shifted around there with the trucks, and you know, actually the Germans could make a lot of very silly moves here, give up that river line and just drop back, give up this area as a supply, even though it's their supply source. They could do a lot of very silly things purely on the very gamey basis that they only have to survive 3 turns without that hex falling. That's slightly not frustrating, but you know, I'm not going to just throw the game as the Germans just on the basis that they want to hold some arbitrary line here. On the other, so I am going to protect the objective hex. I'm just not willing to make utterly ridiculous moves doing it. But they've pulled back out of here and presented a far more solid defensive line now to this tank brigade and other units under there. And they're just looking in a far more solid position. Obviously a Russian attack in Russian initiative completely changes the game from a balance point of view. So that opening initial initiative roll is pretty critical to how this all pans out. What I was thinking though was it might be a lot more fun if there were a range of objective hexes and some sort of random chip pull determination, so that only the Russians knew where they were actually going and the Germans had an idea of a range of objective hexes. So, you know, that one looks sensible, but also, for example, hex 2824 in there, the far side of this bridge, would look like a viable point to try and be defending, and there may be something up over here. And so you could have like 3 hexes and a random chip pull to see which ones the Russians were actually trying to take, and that would prevent this kind of auto camping on the victory hex that the Germans can do to kind of dampen any the game as a contest in the opening movement phase. And I think that would potentially work quite well. The only problem is that then you might have to think about, well, is this hex really takeable in 3 turns under any circumstances, because the main Russian force is all the way up over here. So you might have to extend the game out to 4 turns or whatever. But it would certainly change the dynamic in terms of this initial rush by the Germans straight away from where they were over to camp around a different town, purely because that's where the victory hex is. There it is. Some minor gripes about the actual scenario, technicality of the scenario, but I'll carry on and see. You know, I could be completely wrong. It could be that this just crumbles under a Russian attack anyway, and that it wasn't a particularly good move. But I don't see how not defending the victory hex is a better move than defending it. So I'm just going to plough on and see how it turns out. Anyway, those are my thoughts at the moment. Enemy at the gates in the Chir River battles, and it's the end of turn 1. And you can see that the Germans have been considerably thinned out by Soviet attacks. Lots of overruns. You know, the Russians have got enough quality here, or enough strength, that even units like, say, this Guard infantry here can overrun an alert battalion. It's got the 3 movement points it requires. I can't see anything. I've been looking for reasons why it's illegal and I can't find any. So you know, the Russians went ahead with some of these cavalry units and some of these infantry and just blasted alert battalions out of the way in overruns. And if they took you know, options, then they retreated, because a lot of the time they caused losses. So a lot of attacker option 1, defender lose 1 option 1 results on the sort of 4-1 and 5-1 tables, which resulted in the Russians not making much progress, but destroying, carving a huge holes through the through what, you know, at the start of the game looks like a defensive line along this river, and it's nothing of the sort. It's just speed bumps. So that's got blasted out of the way. The Germans have pulled their Panzer division back here, and that's the serious obstacle between the Russians and the objective hex over here. And this big motorised, I assume 5M is 5th motorised. Anyway, that 5th motorised corps has moved into a sort of striking distance now of the objective, and the Russians just opened up with everything they could, EG'd any stacks that looked like it might pull back and cause any sort of problem, and just left this kind of chaff lying around that it couldn't really get to or deal with. And that's the situation. As far as, I mean, the Russians, I think if I can hold this steady and get in here with some tweezers, we'll see how much supply. The Russians are down to 1.5 supply points, one supply point, 2 T. So they really have just burnt supply like nobody's business. But you know, at the end of an attack, at the end of a 3-turn game, you'd feel foolish if you were meant to be attacking and you still had supply left, wouldn't you? So I'm just burning it, and they'll pick up more at the beginning of next turn. So they'll have 5 supply, and they won't have anywhere near as much attacking to do. And I probably won't make. I won't be burning 6T on a rocket attack with that 75 strength. I can't pronounce the word for it, Katusha or whatever it's called. Anyway, one of those big sort of rocket brigades, that won't be blowing 6T next turn. Yeah, you know, likewise with the rest of the artillery, they're probably nothing to do next turn. So that'll save at least 2.5 supply points, not firing those, and it'll mainly be down here at the business end where this corps is attempting to get to grips with 11th Panzer, and we'll see how all that pans out. So yeah, good fun, and just pushing into turn 2. Midway through the second turn then, and the Russians have moved. I'm not sure what I've still got to do in this turn. I suppose I've got some combat to do. Oh yeah, Russian combat to do, any sort of barrage and combat. That's going to be extremely limited because of my incautious use of Russian supply in the first turn. So I don't know what they've got left here. Let's have a quick look. One SP, 3T. So their combat options are pretty limited given that supply status. But I mean, basically this German Panzer division sat here along this second river line was not something that the Russians felt they had time to go through. Certainly didn't have time, and didn't have the supply either. So they've had to kind of work their way round. 5th Mechanised is now sat there and close to the objective hex, yeah, they've kind of pulled a bit of an outflank and tried to cut off the Germans from getting back and reinforcing it. Pretty, it's an attempt. I don't think it's a successful attempt. I think with 8 movement, any tracked vehicles in there can just walk straight round here and straight back into the hex that they're trying to defend. So it's just pretty cosmetic attempt really, but you have to try, don't you? It'll stand me in good stead for later on, trying to cause these kind of problems and having a look at how to defend should the Germans suddenly decide to romp across on the attack and have a go at that headquarters or something. They could do all kinds of things. The thing about this position, I guess, is that the Russians have left themselves in a situation where if they got initiative, they could at least have a crack at taking the objective hex. If they lose initiative, and they've lost initiative the last 2 turns, if they lose initiative for the 3rd turn and the Germans get to react first, I think this will be nipped. They'll get smashed out of the way and won't be won't be able to get in. But if they won initiative at this point, they would at least have a go at taking the objective. So that's all I can really do for them, and we'll see what the 3rd turn brings. Well, the Russians did get initiative in the 3rd turn, so they got the double move, managed to DG the defenders of this village with this artillery up here, and then went in and roughed it up. They actually had a 4-against-1 advantage on the action ratings, which turned an attack into a surprise attack, gave them a 3-step advantage, and they had something 49 factors against 6.5, so they were 7-1 in close terrain, up to 12-1 I think it was, ended up on the table with +3 on the dice, and that was game over for the defenders. That also burnt the entirety of the Russian supply, but they did capture some in taking this, so it was a final throw of the dice. You can see some low ammo in there. Some of these had to use internal stocks to actually attack. So now it's a question of whether whether the Germans can. I'm going to throw a sort of last roll of the dice kind of counterattack at them. They have got some artillery there that I guess can attempt to disorganise that group, and then we'll have to try and we'll get some supply come on down here, and we'll have to work out what we can get supplied and how much we can swing back round there to try and retake the village in the final combat phase. So let's see how it goes. Well, the counterattack by 11th Panzer was spectacularly successful, devastating in fact. This artillery managed to DG the Russian 5th mechanised units that were holding the victory hex, and then they rolled their armour and mechanised up to the Russians. Had initially an attack that was about 30 factors against. After they were DG'd, it was 19 factors, but after they were DG'd, so it was 9.5. So they had 3-1, but they also had an AR of 5 against a 4 down to a 3 because the DG, and that +2 on the surprise roll gave them surprise. 5 columns shift in their favour, and suddenly it was 12-1, and they rolled high enough to kill 1 unit. The actual result was defender lose 1 option 2. It was attacker exploit 4, defender lose 1 option 2 DG'd, and the crazy thing was that there were 4 defending units, but one of them got killed by the artillery barrage. They got a half result in the artillery barrage and rolled a 6, which produced a step loss, and that was 1 unit gone. And then a kill 1 option 2 meant that if the Russians stuck around, they lost all 3 units, or they had to retreat, or they had to lose 1 and retreat out of the victory hex. So either way, they lose the hex, and the 11th Panzer rolled in. They actually chose to retreat. The remaining 2 units are sat in there, but that couldn't have worked out much better. But it was pretty long odds counterattack. I mean, it didn't. You wouldn't count on it happening every time, but that was a really solid counterattack by the 11th Panzer there, and so the Germans have won this one. Just sneaked it right at the end. There's no point in continuing. That's the end of it all. And that's the sort of final situation, although to be fair, pretty much everything over in this area I've been completely ignoring, because it becomes completely irrelevant to the battle over this little village over here. I have no doubt made some extremely bad and unsafe moves throughout this game, but it's been a lot of fun, and just got me back, given me the taste for OCS again after a bit of a layoff. And now I think I'm going to set up something slightly bigger, and or at least start pulling out all the units and doing all the reading and prep I need to set up something bigger in the morning. So yeah, there it is.